We're very pleased to introduce this evening's speaker, who is Andreas Malm, who I'm sure some of you will know by his work. So Andreas is Associate Professor of Human Ecology at Lund University in Sweden. And he's the author of 5 books, which I'll go through. I'll just name them so you get a sense of the scope of his work. His first book was published in 2007 and was called Iran on the Brink, Rising Workers and Threats of War. It was co-written with Shora Ismailan. His second book was Fossil Capital, The Rise of Steam Power and the Roots of Global Warming, published in 2016. Then in 2017 he published The Progress of This Storm, Nature and Society in a Warming World. In 2021 he published How to Blow Up a Pipeline, Learning to Fight in a World on Fire, which remarkably was made into a film a couple of years later. And finally his most recent book is entitled White Skin, Black Fuel on the Danger of Fossil Fascism, and this was co-written with the Zetkin Collective and published in 2021 by Verso. So Andreas's projects, his work focuses on the political economy of negative emissions technologies, and he's recently co-edited a volume entitled Has It Come to This? The Promises and Perils of Geoengineering on the Brink. And he's now currently working on a big book project whose title is Follow the River, A People's History of Wilderness, which I believe is still in progress. Okay, so thanks. Join me in welcoming Andreas.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Ray. Thanks so much, Nadia, and everyone else who has organized this trip. I feel incredibly fortunate and grateful for being here. So we are just about to clock half a year of the genocide in Gaza. On Sunday, it will be half a year since the resistance launched Tufan al-Aqsa and the occupation responded by declaring and executing genocide. It's been half a year, 6 months, 184 days of bombs picking off one family after another, one high-rise building after another, one residential district after another, relentlessly, methodically. Half a year of the grey bones of children poking out under the rubble, of rows of tiny white body bags lined up on the ground, of a mutilated girl hanging from a window as from a meat hook. We've all seen these pictures. And one can go insane with despair watching these scenes from a distance. And if one feels that way, then one should, of course, try to imagine how the people feel who are still alive in Gaza. So the state of Israel is now committing the worst crime known to humanity. And this particular genocide has, I believe, some unique characteristics that set it apart from others on the recent record. First of all, this genocide has, from day one, been a transnational effort, coordinated and organized by the advanced capitalist countries of the West in conjunction with the State of Israel. The US and the UK and Germany and France and most other EU members immediately rushed to participate, sending arms to the occupation as so many dishes to a banquet, flying over Gaza to share intelligence with the headquarters and pilots, rolling out the diplomatic defenses around the state, and as if that were not enough, taking the last crumbs from the hands of the Palestinians. Now that they are starving, then the US and the UK are cutting off the last lifeline of the UNRWA too. One could be forgiven for thinking that they want the Palestinians to die. This has been the picture during the first half year of this genocide. So far it has been one monochrome scene of cooperation, and I think no other genocide on the list since the Holocaust has presented a similar picture. From Bangladesh to Guatemala, Sudan to Myanmar, genocides might have been perpetrated with varying degrees of complicity from the capitalist core, but here we are dealing with something qualitatively different. A useful comparison would be with the genocide against the Bosnian Muslims, an event that shaped my own political youth. With the arms embargo, the West denied that people the right to defend themselves. Through their retreat from Srebrenica, the Dutch forces knowingly handed over that town to Ratko Mladic. In the 4 years of the war, the so-called international community stood by as the Bosnian Muslims were decimated. But these were primarily acts of omission. The West didn't arm Republika Srpska with the best bombs from its arsenals. Bill Clinton didn't fly in to hug Slobodan Milosevic. The slaughter was not accompanied by the constant refrain, the Serb nationalists have the right to defend themselves. What we're seeing now might be the first advanced late capitalist genocide. One component of the definition of genocide is, of course, the physical destruction in whole or in part of the targeted group of people. And in Gaza, a central category is precisely that of physical destruction. The emblematic image of this genocide is that of a house smashed into pieces and survivors frantically digging through the rubble. If they are lucky, a boy or a girl, or covered in dust, might be pulled out from the mass of debris. While it has never before approached the scale we're now seeing, this isn't exactly the first time the Palestinians have experienced this sort of thing. The script can be found in Plan de Let, where Zionist forces were instructed in the art of destroying villages by setting fire to them, by blowing them up, and by planting mines in their rubble. A typical procedure of the Nakba was for the forces to invade a village during the night and systematically dynamite one house after another with families still inside them. But a peculiarity of the Palestinian experience is that this never comes to an end. The original act of destroying the houses over the heads of their inhabitants is repeated again and again and again. In Al-Majdal in 1950, from which the people were deported to Gaza, in Gaza in 2024, and in between any number of these eternal recurrences. Fresh rubble is always poured out over the Palestinians. Destruction is the constitutive experience of Palestinian life because the essence of the Zionist project is the destruction of Palestine. This time, unlike in 1948 or 1950, however, the destruction of Palestine is playing out against the backdrop of a much larger process of destruction, namely that of the climate system of this planet. Climate breakdown is the process of ecosystems being physically destroyed from the Arctic to Australia. In our book, The Long Heat, Climate Politics When It's Too Late, forthcoming from Verso in 2025, my colleague Wim Carton and I discuss in some detail how rapidly this process is now unfolding. To take but one example, the Amazon is caught up in a spiral of dieback that might end with it becoming a treeless savanna. The Amazon rainforest has been standing for 65 million years, and now in the span of a few short decades, global warming, together with deforestation, the original form of ecological destruction, is pushing the Amazon towards the tipping point beyond which it would exist no more. Indeed, much recent research suggests that the Amazon is perched on that point as we speak. If the Amazon were to lose its forest cover, a dizzying thought, but entirely within the realm of a possible near future, it would be a different kind of Nakba. The immediate victims would, of course, be the indigenous and Afro-descendant and other people of the Amazon, some 40 million in all, who would, in the most likely scenario, see fires rip through their forest and turn it into a smoke, and so live through the end of their world. Sometimes, this process takes on a remarkable morphological similarity to the events in Gaza, even in geographical proximity. On the night to September 11 last year, less than a month before the start of the genocide, Storm Daniel hit Libya. In the eastern city of Darna, on the shores of the Mediterranean, about 1,000 kilometers from Gaza, people were killed in their sleep. Suddenly, a force from the sky destroyed the homes on top of them. Afterwards, reports described how random furniture and body parts poked up through pulverized buildings. I quote one. Corpses still litter the street and drinkable water is in short supply. The storm has killed whole families. According to one native of the town, it was a catastrophe unlike anything we have ever seen. The residents are searching for the bodies of their loved ones by digging with their hands and simple agricultural tools. There were Palestinian first responders rushing to the scene. According to one of them, I quote, "The devastation is beyond all imagination. You walk through the city and see nothing but mud, silt, and demolished houses. The smell of corpses is everywhere. Entire families have been erased from the civil registry. You see death everywhere," end quote. During its 24 hours visitation, Storm Daniel dropped a load of water around 70 times larger than the average amount for the month of September in eastern Libya. Darna was located at the mouth of a river, running through a wadi towards the sea, normally within narrow banks, if indeed it ran at all. This was a desert country. But now suddenly the river rose, burst through two dams and crashed into Darna, the water, sediment, debris forming a bulldozer that ripped and roared through the city in the middle of the night to September 11. a force of such speed and violence as to drive structures and streets into the Mediterranean and turn the former city center into a brownish, muddy bog. Using the by now refined methodologies of weather attribution, researchers could quickly conclude that the floods had been made 50 times more likely by the global warming experienced so far. Mathematical code for the cause of the disaster. Only this warming could have brought about that event. During the preceding summer months, the waters of North Africa had been no less than 5.5 degrees warmer than the average from the previous 2 decades. And warm water holds heat energy that can get packed into a storm like fuel into a missile. Some 11,300 people were killed in one single night by Storm Daniel in Libya, the most intense event of mass killing by climate change so far in the decade, possibly the century. These scenes formed a striking prefiguration of those that would begin to play out in Gaza 26 days later. But there were also direct connections between the places. Because rescue teams in Gaza have long been used to dealing with this kind of destruction, they moved swiftly into Derna to help out. At least a dozen Palestinians who had fled from Gaza to Derna were killed in the floods. One Palestinian, Faiz Abu Amra, told Reuters. 2 catastrophes took place, the catastrophe of the displacement and the storm in Libya. And the Arabic word for catastrophe here, of course, being Nakba. So according to Faiz Abu Amra, the first Nakba was the one of 1948, which drove his family and 800,000 other Palestinians out of their homeland. His family ended up in Mukhayam Deir al-Balah, and then some members moved on to get away from the Israeli wars of aggression to the town of Derna, and then came a second Nakba. Faiz Abu Amra lost several relatives in the storm. He himself survived because he had chosen to stay behind in Deir al-Balah, where mourning tents were erected for the victims. And then came, just a few weeks later, the genocide. God knows if Faiz Abu Amra is still alive. This leads us to the questions that I will keep in focus for the rest of this lecture. Are there any specific moments of articulation between the destruction of Palestine and the destruction of the earth? And by moments of articulation, I mean points where one process impacts and forms the other in a reciprocating causation, a dialectic of determination. And I will argue that yes, indeed, such moments of articulation have linked up in a rather tight sequence for almost 2 centuries now. And I'm a history nerd. What I like to do most is to do research on primary sources and go back in history to points in time when things began to be the way they are now. I am now going to go back to the moment when I think much of what we're seeing today began, and that moment is 1840. The events of that year have been a perennial obsession of mine. I've touched upon them here and there, but I have yet to write a coherent account. I began doing this research 11 years ago towards the end of my PhD, which then became the book Fossil Capital. I realized that this stuff required a study of its own, a sequel to be called Fossil Empire. But my applications for research grants would turn out, so I haven't been able to do this work properly. But now in the past weeks, before coming here, I felt I want to return again to this moment in time. And what I'll offer here are just some preliminary and by necessity very simplified and condensed and incomplete findings. But please allow me to geek out a little bit on 1840. I should also say that over the past half year, so I have a long, before I started writing my academic stuff, I wrote things about Palestine. I was going to go back to Palestine for the first time in 19 years on October the 10th. The flight was cancelled the day before. Then throughout this whole half year, I've been immersed in other projects, while obviously the only thing you want to talk about in this situation is Palestine. The result for me being that when I started writing this lecture, it became a monster and much longer than what I can share with you here for reasons of time. However, if you do find this interesting and want to read on more aspects of what I talk about here, the whole monster will go up online on the Verso blog on Sunday. So what I'll give here are the main outlines. Okay. How are we doing for time now? Okay, yeah, good. Okay. 1840 was a pivotal year in history for both the Middle East and the climate system. It marked the first time the British Empire deployed steamboats in a major war. Steam power was the technology through which dependence on fossil fuels came into being. Steam engines ran on coal, and it was their diffusion through the industries of Britain that turned this into the first fossil economy. But steam power would never have made an imprint on the climate if it had stayed inside the British Isles. Only by exporting it to the rest of the world and drawing humanity into the spiral of large-scale fossil fuel combustion did Britain change the fate of this planet. The globalization of steam was a necessary ignition. And the key to this ignition, in turn, was the deployment of steamboats in war. It was through the projection of violence that Britain integrated other countries into the strange kind of economy it had created, by turning fossil capital, we might say, into fossil empire. At this time, Britain was the largest empire in the world had ever seen, built on naval supremacy, hitherto founded on the traditional motive power of wind. But in the 1820s, the Royal Navy began to consider steam propulsion, so burning coal, instead of sailing with the wind. Wind being a renewable source, as we would call it today, inexhaustible, cheap, indeed free of cost, but with well-known limitations. The captains could not take for granted that the wind blew as they wished it to. On the battlefield, ships might be held back by calms or driven away from their targets by gusts and gales in the wrong direction, or allowed to advance only slowly. Freaks of the wind could give the enemy opportunities to slip away, regroup, hit back. In military action, when the mobilization of energy was most urgently needed, wind was an unreliable force. Steam obeyed another logic. It derived its force from a source of energy that had no relation to the weather conditions, the winds, currents, waves, tides. Coal came from the stock underground, a legacy of photosynthesis, hundreds of millions of years old, and once brought above ground, it could be burnt at whatever point and whatever moment the owner demanded. The striking force of a steamer could be summoned at will. A fleet of such vessels could be arranged just as the captains wanted it. Cannons pointed, troops landed, enemies chased down, no matter how the wind blew. Such freedoms were particularly stressed by Admiral Charles Napier, the most energetic champion of steam in the Royal Navy, who summed them up pithily: steamers make the wind always fair. Or, steam has gained such a complete conquest over the elements, it appears to me that we are now in possession of all that was required to make maritime war perfect. The conquest of the elements was ultimately a function of the spatio-temporal profile of fossil fuels. Because of their detachment from space and time on the surface of the Earth, they promised to liberate the empire from the coordinates in which boats had navigated since time immemorial. The first time Napier got to practice this perfection was in 1840, right here on the shores of Lebanon and Palestine. In that year, Britain went to war against Muhammad Ali. Ali was the Pasha of Egypt, nominally serving under the Ottoman Empire, but in practice the ruler of his own realm, which by now was in a state of war with the Sultan. Ali's forces had fanned out from Egypt and conquered the Hijaz and the Levant, and formed an Arab proto-empire on a collision course with the Porte and with London. Now, I don't have the time here to go into the many fascinating details of Ali's regime and the nature of the collision. There will be a little bit more in the published version of this lecture. So if you're interested, you can look at it there. But I'm just going to jump straight to the events of the war of the late summer of 1840, when the foreign secretary of the British Empire and the chief architect of it in the mid-19th century, Lord Palmerston, ordered the Royal Navy to collect its best steamboats. In the late summer of 1840, a state-of-the-art squadron under the command of Napier set off towards the town of Beirut. Napier's favorite vessel was called the Gorgon, propelled by a 350 horsepower steam engine with room for 380 tons of coal, 1,600 soldiers and 6 guns. It was the first true fighting steamship, marking a new era. Napier took the Gorgon to reconnoiter the area around Beirut, running up and down the coast as he saw fit, in splendid disregard of the weather. But he did send out a pressing request to his fellow officers. He wrote, "You must send me coal vessels here at all costs, because steamers without coal are useless." End quote. On September 9, the bombardment of Beirut began. Gorgon and 3 other steamers took the lead, further 15 sailing ships arrayed around them. Their funnels spewing smoke, the steamers had a distinctive ability to circle the Bay of Beirut back and forth and harass the Egyptian defenders commanded by Ali's son Ibrahim Pasha. Other targets appear to have been hit as well. After a day of particularly severe shelling, on September 11, the local general sent a letter of accusation to the British fleet. He wrote, "For the sake of killing 5 of my soldiers, you have ruined and brought families into desolation. You have killed women, a tender infant and its mother, an old man, 2 unfortunate peasants, and doubtless many others whose names have not yet reached me. Your fire, I say, became more vigorous and destructive for the unfortunate peasants rather than for my soldiers. You appear decided to make yourselves masters of the town." Some sources from within Beirut claim that around 1,000 people were killed in the bombardment, their bodies strewn about the streets. The crew on a US cruiser reported that, quote, "All the buildings, both private and public, were in a heap of ruins. The English fleet were firing upon the few buildings remaining and were determined not to leave one stone upon another, and the town presents a scene of havoc and destruction." After this feat, the steamers chased Ibrahim Pasha's troops along the coast, and from Latakia in the north via Trablus and Sur to Haifa in the south, their positions fell like dominoes, the defenders withdrawing under the relentless, unpredictable attacks. "Steam gives us great superiority, and we shall keep them moving," Napier exulted. "Ibrahim must march very quick if he could beat steam." A gratified Lord Palmerston, the Foreign Secretary, followed the news from the front line, rapidly dispatched with steam packets to London, and wrote back, "The more force can be accumulated in Syria, the better." And next he ordered an attack on the Palestinian town of Akka. Everyone knew that the decisive battle would stand there. Akka had famously held out for half a year against Napoleon in 1799, and then again for half a year in 1831, when Ibrahim Pasha laid siege to it. Since then, the Egyptians had repaired the walls of the old Crusader capital, armed its ramparts with heavy guns, and garrisoned it with thousands of troops, reinforcing the standing of Akka as by far the sturdiest fortress on the Levantine coast. A major depot, it was filled to the brim with weapons and ammunitions, most of them in a central magazine. It was also a thriving town with a civilian population that had nothing to do with military affairs. On the 1st of November 1840, Gorgon and the other 3 steamers appeared in front of Akka. Let me see if I can get this to work. I think it should come, don't you think? Yes. Yeah, so this is, I'll come to this very shortly. On the 1st of November, Gorgon and the other 3 steamers appeared in front of Akka. They were alone. The sailing ships had been delayed by light winds. Napier called on the Egyptians to surrender. When they refused, the bombarding began. One report described the action. The service of steamships in war was thus shown. The steam division of the Allies, having arrived in the bay, immediately commenced throwing shot and shells into the town, which must have annoyed the garrison very much as, although they returned a very brisk fire, from the steamers constantly shifting their positions, it was harmless. On the evening of the 2nd of November, the wind-powered remainder of the fleet arrived, and a proper line of battle was arranged, like this. The special mobility of the new mode of propulsion would be fully utilized, the steamers forming the central prong of the assault. So the 4 vessels in the middle are the steamboats, and the other 2 here are the sailing ships. In the afternoon of 3rd November, the steamers resumed the pounding of Akka, and the other ships joined in what was, according to Napier, a tremendous fire. The defenders lobbed back their own shots. After 2.5 hours, a deafening detonation ripped through the battlefield. From within Akka, I quote one of the reports, "A mass of fire and smoke suddenly ascended like a volcano into the sky, immediately followed by a shower of materials of all kinds that had been carried up by its force. The smoke rested for a few moments like an immense black dome obscuring everything." And this account continues. "The dreadful crash was heard far above the tumult of the assault and was immediately succeeded by a most awful pause. The firing on both sides was suddenly suspended, and for a few minutes nothing broke the fearful silence but the echoes of the mountains repeating the sound like the rumbling of distant thunder and the occasional fall of some tottering building. Akka's great powder magazine had been hit by a shell. Gorgon was dubbed the hero of the strike. In the confident words of one British captain, the magazine blew up in consequence of a well-directed shell from the Gorgon steam frigate. We cannot rule out that it was an accidental hit, but the British were clearly aware of the position of the magazine, relaying fresh intelligence. Lord Minto, the highest commander of the Royal Navy, informed the command on the ground that, I quote, "there is much powder stored about very insecurely at Acre," and he pointed it out as a suitable target in a letter signed on October 7. Whatever the exact degree of intentionality here, the results of the strike from the first true fighting steamship are not in doubt. The Palestinian town of Akka turned into a mass of rubble. A report to Lord Palmerston said, 2 entire regiments were annihilated and every living creature within the area of 60,000 square yards ceased to exist, the loss of life being variously computed from 1,200 to 2,000 persons, end quote. As night fell on the 3rd of November, the few surviving Arab soldiers evacuated their last positions in Akka, and when the British troops entered the town the next day, they were greeted by utter devastation. Here's one portrait. Corpses of men, women and children, blackened by the explosion of the magazine and mutilated in the most horrid manner by the cannon shot, lay everywhere about, half buried among the ruins of the homes and fortifications. Women were searching for the bodies of their husbands, children for their fathers. End quote. In a letter home to his wife, Charles Napier himself expressed unease and perhaps a pang of guilt. He wrote, "I went on shore at Acre to see the havoc we have occasioned and witnessed a sight that never can be effaced from my memory and makes me at this time even almost shudder to think of it." He saw hundreds of dead and dying lying in the ruins. "The beach for half a mile on each side was strewed with bodies," he wrote. "After some days, the corpses," he wrote, "infected the air with an effluvium that was truly horrid." The British seemed taken aback by the scale of the destruction that they had wrought in Akka. In a letter to Lord Minto, another admiral wrote, "I cannot describe to your lordship the utter destruction of the works in the town from the fire of our ships." End quote. A midshipman from one of the smaller steamers spoke of hands, arms and toes sticking out of the rubble. Barely remembered today, this event attracted an enormous amount of fascination in early Victorian Britain. The fortress that had held out for half a year against Napoleon went down in less than 3 days under the blows of the steamships. On the more popular account, less than 3 hours of concentrated bombing on the 3rd of November. It was a sublime, awe-inspiring, miraculous manifestation of the power of Britain in general and steam in particular, rendered in a series of paintings. Here is another one. Can you see? Or is it too light? You see a little bit, yeah. Here, there's a steamboat here, possibly the Gorgon, pointing straight into Akka. It's a column of smoke kind of communicating with a tremendous eruption from the magazine behind the walls and the minaret. So coal on fire and town on fire. In the next lithograph here, purporting to describe the scene from the perspective of the Arab defenders, the smoke from a steamboat, I don't know if you can see it, it's here, likewise communicates with the tremendous eruption from the magazine behind the walls and the minarets. Sorry, that was wrong. To the left of the whole town is blown sky high there, as you can perhaps see. So this explosion was the centerpiece of the action, but it went further. The steamers made use of their ability to maneuver freely in the waters near the walls of Akka, standing as close as 40 meters away, almost right up to the walls when firing their projectiles, and then driving back out when needed. The bombardment could therefore be more precise and more devastating, and it went on for almost 3 days before the explosion. So, did the British use this overwhelming power to target Ibrahim Pasha's forces with the utmost precision? Well, in the most detailed recent reconstruction of the attack, 4 Israeli researchers write the bombardment was rather aimed at the town itself. In fact, the object of the bombardment was to compel the garrison to surrender, not by the injury which it might have sustained, but by the killing and misery which it inflicted upon non-combatants. End quote. We might recognize this kind of strategic thinking. Yet another admiral described how it worked. Every shot that cleared the walls smashed the tops of houses, hurling walls and stones down on the heads of people below. There was no refuge anywhere. End quote. Whatever compunctions the disembarking men may or may not have felt, back home in Whitehall the joy knew no bounds, and the steamers were widely praised for their efficiency during the battle. One report observed that it is rather remarkable that not one of the 4 steamships had a single man either killed or wounded. If the men went through the action without a scratch, however, another resource was nearly exhausted: fuel. After the battle, not one of the 4 steamers had more than 1 day's supply of coal on board. Practically all the stored coal had been burnt in the pulverization of Akka. The fall of the town determined the outcome of the war in one stroke. Ibrahim Pasha's forces collapsed and beat a disorderly retreat through the coastal plains of Palestine. The steamers continued to harass them, landing at Jaffa and hovering off Gaza. On land, infantry troops moved into Gaza in January 1841 to ensure what they called the destruction of the enemy's provisions. The first time British-led forces occupied this corner of Palestine, if only for a brief moment. The Royal Engineers swiftly produced a map of Gaza. This is the first British map of Gaza that we have. More precisely, Gaza City. This is what it looked like in 1841. You can see Shujaiya to the right. There isn't much of this urban fabric left today. While the British held Gaza and mapped it and destroyed the stores of food, presumably only to deny the Egyptian army its provisions, scattered columns of demoralized, thirsty, hungry soldiers drifted through the desert back into Egypt. And less than 1/4 of the army Ibrahim had commanded at the outbreak of the war returned home. Before their arrival, Napier steamed onwards to the port of Alexandria, where he threatened to subject that town to the same treatment as Akka, unless Muhammad Ali accepted all British demands. Thus did Britain destroy the Arab proto-empire by means of steam. From Beirut to Alexandria, it was the steamers of the Royal Navy that formed the vanguard of the victory, more expert than their wind-powered partners in every maneuver that profited from mobility in space. In an article on the Iron War steamers, the Manchester Guardian quoted an anonymous letter from a British subject in Alexandria, who wrote, "So much has been done of late in the Levant by steam that everybody is now alive to its capabilities as an element either of war or peace and is ready to ask, what will it do next? Ibrahim Pasha can only account for his loss of the coast of Syria in a week by confessing that," and this is a purported quotation from Ibrahim Pasha himself, "the steamboats conveyed the enemy here, there, and everywhere so suddenly that it would have required wings to keep up with them. One might as well think of fighting with a jenny." This power derived from fossil fuels. Steam allowed the admirals and captains to plug their boats into a current from the past, a source of energy external to the space and time of the actual battle, through which the ships could therefore shoot as though they had wings of their own. Britain's military superiority was radically enhanced by its ability to mobilize the stock of energy as a force for running the enemy down. Or, as the Observer noticed with reference to Palestine, quote, "Steam, even now, almost realizes the idea of military omnipotence and military omnipresence. It is everywhere and there is no withstanding it." End quote. So Britain was now ready to project the power of fossil fuels across the globe after having proved its mettle in Palestine. Okay, the country whose fate was most immediately sealed by these events was Egypt. But because of time constraints, I will skip what happened in Egypt here and jump straight to the second country whose fate was at least written in the stars at this time, namely Palestine. In 1840, the British Empire first proposed the colonization of that country by Jews. More precisely, On the 25th of November, Lord Palmerston wrote to Lord Ponsonby, his ambassador in Istanbul, quote, "This is a great triumph to us all," referring to the fall of Akka a few weeks old, "especially to you who always maintained that Mehmet's power would crumble under European attack." And then he went on. "Pray try to do what you can about these Jews. You have no idea to what extent the interest felt about them goes, and it would be extremely politic if we could make the Sultan give them every encouragement and facility for returning and buying lands in Palestine, and if they were allowed to make use of our consuls and ambassador as the channel of complaint, that is to say, place themselves virtually under our protection, they would come back in considerable numbers and bring with them much wealth." End quote. 57 years before the first Zionist Congress, 77 years before the Balfour Declaration, 107 years before the partition plan, the chief architect of the British Empire near the summit of its power here laid down the formula for the colonization of Palestine. For some reason, this particular document appears to have never been cited in the entire historiography, but it's all there encapsulated in a missive sent in the euphoria after the pulverization of Akka. 1840 saw the first mania for what we now know as the Zionist project. It had been in the making for a few years. As is fairly well known, Britain in the late 1830s experienced a surge of Christian Zionism, the doctrine that Jews must be gathered and restored to Palestine, where they will convert to Christianity, so cease being Jews, and precipitate the second coming of Christ and usher in the last days. The main evangelist of this gospel was the Earl of Shaftesbury, who was related through marriage to Lord Palmerston, and he tried to make the most of this family bond, but when he spoke to the Foreign Secretary, he had to put his religious arguments to the side. After dinner with Palmerston on the 1st of August 1840, the godly but shrewd Shaftesbury noted in his diary that, "I am forced to argue politically, financially, commercially. These considerations strike him home," end quote. But eschatology and empire were not incompatible. God and mammon mixed rather well. Lady Palmerston, the wife of the Foreign Secretary, together with whom he apparently formed his opinions, read the fall of Akka through her Bible. I quote, "It cannot be an accident that all these things should have so turned out. My impression is that it is the restoration of the Jews and fulfillment of the prophecies. It is certainly very curious, and Acre, that is Akka, seems to have fallen down like the walls of Jericho, and Abraham's army dispersed like the countless hosts that were enemies of the Jews, as we see in the Old Testament." End quote. Now, it should be pointed out already here that this was a wholly Gentile, Christian, white Anglo-Saxon fantasy in which actual Jews living in the Middle East or elsewhere played no active role. Lord Palmerston himself clearly saw the pulverization of Akka as a sign of not the end times, but a new era of prosperity. In another letter, and this document has been cited relatively often, Palmerston told Ponsonby, so the ambassador, to convince the Sultan to, quote, "encourage the Jews to return and settle in Palestine, because the wealth which they would bring with them would increase the resources of the Sultan's dominions," end quote. Moreover, a Jewish settlement would serve as, quote, "a check upon any future evil designs by Mehmet Ali or his successor," end quote. Throughout the Eastern crisis, Palmerston again and again dictated the rationale in letters to his ambassador. A return of the Jews to Palestine would implant what he called a great number of wealthy capitalists. If the Sultan would only accept them, he would earn the friendship of powerful classes in this country, in the UK that is. Again, the capital and the industry of the Jews would much increase his revenue and add greatly to the strength of his empire, end quote. We can here see a kind of brain scan of imperialist Zionism, because the Jews would be tied to the metropole. Giving Palestine to them would help unfetter capitalist development and prevent the rise of new recalcitrant challengers in the region. As a measure of just how mainstream this scheme had become, the Times ran an article on August 17, while Napier was running up and down the Lebanese coast on the Gorgon, explaining that a Jewish settlement of Palestine would function as, quote, "a breastwork against the further encroachments of lawless tyranny and of social degeneracy. It would be advantageously employed for the interests of civilization in the East," end quote. On the ground, the advanced detachments of Zionism were formed by officers in the imperial bureaucracy. Some of them came fresh from the battlefield. A colonel by the name of Churchill, a distant relative of the more famous Winston Churchill, commanded the British forces that marched into Damascus in early 1841, assembled various dignitaries in a hall, and gave a speech. He said, "Yes, my friends, there was once a Jewish people, famous in arts and renowned in war. These beautiful plains and valleys, which are now tenanted by the wild and wandering Arab, on which desolation has fixed her iron stamp, once reveled in the luxuriance of their fertile and abundant crops, and resounded with the songs of the daughters of Zion. May the hour of Israel's deliverance be near at hand." I could quote a great many other statements of this kind from 1840 and the years just after, but I refer to the unabridged version of this, published on Sunday. However, it's clear that this 1840 was the moment of conception for two interrelated principles. One, no people exist in Palestine, and two, the land must be taken with the force of technology running on fossil fuels. As for the former, contemporary Zionists now debate who first came up with the slogan, "A land without a people for a people without a land," but there is consensus that it happened around the year 1840. Some point to an article that Shaftesbury wrote in the Times in 1839, where he used the phrase "earth without people, people without land." Earth without people sounding perhaps slightly more chilling today. Others give the honor to his fellow Christian Zionist Alexander Keith, who went on an expedition to Palestine in 1839 and somehow managed to return with the impression that this was what he called a country without a people, crying out for the arrival of what he called a people without a country. But now, he wrote, a miracle had transpired in this country. I quote, "As if commissioned by the Lord," this is about Akka, "a bomb penetrated a magazine of powder stored up for defense and raised the arsenal in the air as if to show that the time was come that the last fortress in Palestine should cease, and strewed it stone by stone upon the ground. Strewed it stone by stone upon the ground, as if the times too were not distant when the hands of strangers should find other work and build up the ruined walls in another form. Acre fell to the lot of a tribe of Israel." End quote. It now became a persistent theme of British commentary on Palestine that no people lived in that land. And the mania also crossed the Atlantic and reached the United States of America. In the weeks before the fall of Akka, one influential, relatively progressive periodical called the Western Messenger knew which way the wind was blowing and wrote, "Now that steamships ride in the Bay of Alexandria and steamboats break the waters of the Nile and the roar of steam cars dashing over railways is heard, is it not morally certain that the Muslim power has ceased?" End quote. The time had come to give the Jews possession of Palestine. They would take and defend the land with a military might and send all sorts of profits flowing back to the West. But the first American Zionist of import, who, unlike nearly all of his British counterparts, also happened to be Jewish, was a guy called Mordecai Manuel Noah. And in 1844, he delivered a discourse on the restoration of the Jews. He never visited Palestine, but he seems to have learned from the British travelers that the land is now desolate, although he did relay that, I quote, "olives and olive oil are everywhere found," end quote, "and wheat and corn and cotton and tobacco grow in the plains and hills, and, quote, grapes of the largest kind flourish everywhere," end quote. Now, great and important revolutions were underway in that land. Noah latched on to the view that the demise of Muhammad Ali heralded what he called the organization of a powerful government in Judea. And he implored the US to take it under its wings. He observed, "The discovery and application of steam will be found to be a great auxiliary in the promotion of this interesting experiment. It placed American Jews within a few days' travel of Jerusalem. Our Mediterranean and Levant trade, hitherto much neglected, will be revived, affording facilities to reach Palestine from this country direct." It then reverted to the default view that no economic activities were occurring as of now in the land, and then anticipated that, quote, "the ports of the Mediterranean will be again open to the busy hum of commerce, the fields will again bear the fruitful harvest," end quote. And he looked forward to a future when, I quote again, the whole territory surrounding Jerusalem, including the villages Hebron, Safat, Tyre, also Beirut, Jaffa, and other ports of the Mediterranean, will be occupied by enterprising Jews. The valleys of the Jordan will be filled by agriculturalists from the north of Germany, Poland, and Russia. Merchants will occupy the seaports, and the commanding positions within the walls of Jerusalem will be purchased by the wealthy and pious of our brethren. End quote. Some prophecies really do come true. Okay. So can I go on for a little bit more?
Yeah, let's say the 15 minutes.
15 minutes, yeah. What do we make of all this? Well, here is the first moment of articulation. The moment that ignited the globalization of steam through its deployment in war was also the moment that conceived the Zionist project. But there was no perfect synchrony. Zionism was as yet only an idea. No Jewish settlement in Palestine developed in the wake of 1840. So strictly speaking, the Palmerstons, Shaftesbury, Churchill, Noah, and the others all failed. They were ahead of their time by half a century. But when the Zionist movement was eventually assembled, it was a wagon that could be placed on ready-made tracks laid out by the British Empire after 1840. The dominant classes of the metropole had already constructed the logic of its satellite colony in Palestine, if only as a mental image. Zionism did not take material form in 1840, like the exercise of steam-powered violence did. We might conclude from this that the latter had causal primacy in history. Zionism first existed at the level of superstructure on the base of the fossil empire. Now, I don't say this with a pretension to revolutionary discovery. The broad contours of this story can be found in the existing historiography, including the most recent sustained engagement with the period, a book called Promised Lands, The British and the Ottoman Middle East by Jonathan Perry. He chronicles how the British thrust into the region by means of steam. He writes, I quote, "From the 1830s, steam power was a valuable aid in intimidating Arabs into appreciating British might." End quote. Beyond the Levant, two Arab lands in particular were subjected to this might, Yemen and Iraq. In 1839, Aden was occupied and annexed as a coaling station for steamboats. In the late 1830s, various experiments with steam communication were launched on the Euphrates. By 1841, when the British had done away with the main obstacle, Perry wrote, I quote, "Their regional naval supremacy was undisputed. Whether steam might civilize the Arabs was a question for the long term," Perry coyly adds. He works in the tradition of gentlemanly, tea-sipping British history writing, and so refuses to draw out implications or follow lines. But the attentive reader can make out the narrative arc. He states, "A large proportion of the things that the British ever thought about the Middle East had already been thought by 1854. I think we can sharpen this and state that a large proportion of the things the British and the Americans ever thought about Palestine had already been thought by 1844. And it began with extreme technological superiority, the penetration of the region by means of cutting-edge fossil-fueled machines. That kind of subjugation would remain in place up to the present day. What happened in 1840 was no ephemeral intrusion like Napoleon's campaign. The British would not let go of the Middle East. They moved only deeper and deeper into it until in the last decade of the 19th century, having occupied Egypt, they had risen so high as to lay the Ottoman Empire low enough for colonization of Palestine to get going. All the UK ever did was to share this power with and pass it on to the US, but as the ongoing bombardment of Yemen testifies, the British are still very much there." A few more words on the dialectic of mind and matter might be in order here. There's an odd spiral of reality and fantasy at work in the moment of 1840. The British really did turn one Palestinian town into ruins. And then they started imagining that all of Palestine was one landscape of ruins, and I've just provided a very, very small sample of this kind of discourse. That it was desolate, deserted, depopulated, fanciful constructions at best, but rather adequate representations of what Akka seems to have looked like after the 3rd of November. And in the next coils of the spiral, the ideational emptying of the land became a precursor to the real thing. Earth without people is the prescription for a Nakba. Ever the pioneers, the British undertook a prefigurative elimination of the Palestinian people. At this moment in time, curiously, the Jews still had a position rather symmetrical to the Palestinians. They existed as characters in the plot, but purely in the realm of the imagination. Real Jews did not count here. Real Jews did not initiate this mania. Real Jews did not clamor to abandon their homes for Palestine. Rather to the contrary, as even one Zionist scholar has noticed about this moment in time, and about the second half of the 19th century generally, he writes, British Jewry was opposed to anything that might seem to impugn its status as wholly English. English Jews could only be embarrassed by the suggestion that they were waiting to go back to Palestine, end quote. So before Zionism was Jewish, it was imperial. But real Jews would, of course, in time be recruited into the Zionist project, and real Palestinians would be erased from physical existence in their land. And set in the context of this longue durée, the genocide in Gaza does not perhaps appear all that accidental. One of the bravest voices outside of Gaza in the past half year has been Francesca Albanese, the UN Special Rapporteur. In her recent, incredibly compelling report on the genocide, she is even brave enough to draw on the School of Settler Colonial Studies to explain it. She writes, I quote, Israel's actions have been driven by a genocidal logic integral to its settler colonial project in Palestine, signaling a tragedy foretold, end quote. And so, genocidal extermination, on this view, is the climax of settler colonialism, and in Palestine, from the moment of 1948, Albanese writes, displacing and erasing the indigenous Arab presence has been an inevitable part of the forming of Israel as a Jewish state, end quote. She's right, of course. But settler colonialism in Palestine never stood on its own feet and never could have. And the tragedy was foretold earlier than by Joseph Weitz and his likes. The Palestinians were figuratively spirited out of Palestine already 183 years before this genocide, and with some interruptions and fits and starts, the materialization and escalation of the act have been in motion ever since. Consider the words from Isaac Herzog, president of the occupation, adduced by Albanese as one instance of genocidal intent. He affirmed in October and November that his entity fights on behalf of what he called all civilized states and peoples against a barbarism that has no place in the modern world. It will uproot evil and it will be good for the entire region of the world, end quote. These words could have been put in his mouth by the Anglo-Zionists of 1840. We might paraphrase the motto of the School of Settler Colonial Studies and say that imperial support for the Zionist entity is a structure, not an event. The structure was forged by the exceptional power accorded to those armed with fossil fuels and has continued to function that way, as I will now very briefly argue. But before I do so, let me just point out one last thing about 1840. The account I have given here is sketchy and partial, and most problematically, it relies exclusively on English primary sources. I don't read Arabic, so I can't say whether there is an Arabic historiography of 1840, nor does Perry read Arabic, but he tells us, quote, there are many non-English archives that seem not yet to have been fully used by anyone. Whatever Arabic sources from and about 1840 exist, and whatever they say about this original encounter with the power of steam and the notions of Zionism, they clearly have not yet left a trace in the Anglophone historiography. Deep research on this moment would begin with some digging outside the metropole. Okay, 7 more minutes. Yeah. Now, I'll be extremely sweeping and synoptic in what follows. When the first Zionist colonies were built, one could find excited reports in the Western press such as the following. The Jews who are now going to Palestine take with them the progressive spirit of the century, and before long, travelers in that country may hear the steam whistle and the clatter of machinery and see all around them the bustle of business instead of the traditional apathy and listlessness of the Orient. This is the National Repository in 1877. When the British Empire actually occupied Palestine and set about implementing the Balfour Declaration, the fossil fuel of the day was not coal, it was oil. Promising deposits had recently been located in the countries bordering the Persian Gulf, and the central industrial project of the mandate came to be the pipeline that brought crude oil all the way from Iraq across the northern West Bank and the Galilee to the refinery of Haifa. The mandate as such cannot be understood outside the deepening control over the region in the pursuit of oil. And the mandate used oil to reallocate land from Palestinians to Jews. In his forthcoming book, Heat, a History, a wonderfully rich history of high temperatures and fossil fuels in the Middle East, Barak shows, among many other things, how the Yishuv wrested citrus production from Palestinians by linking up with the most modern circuits of technology, irrigating their orchards with fossil-fueled pumps, loading their fruits on lorries, sending them over roads to ports, offloading them onto steamers to the European market. A symbiosis with a fossil empire by which the natives could be squeezed out from their iconic sea-tree culture. The mandate authorities systematically privileged the building of roads between colonies. Oil-based infrastructure tilted Palestine in the direction of the settlements on the coastal plains and further towards their patrons on the other side of the ocean. When Zionist forces began to terrorize the Palestinians of Haifa to drive them out of the city, Ilan Papier tells us, quote, rivers of ignited oil and fuel were sent down the mountainside. When the top echelons of the US empire discussed whether to throw in their lot with the Zionist entity during the Nakba, they had oil interests foremost in mind. Some argued that these would be better served by siding with the Arabs, but as Irene El Genzir, or however her name is pronounced, has demonstrated in Dying to Forget, Oil, Power, Palestine, and the Foundations of US Policy in the Middle East, the government of the US was swayed by the argument that a Palestinian victory would, quote, increase Arab self-reliance, demands, and bargaining power, end quote, whereas the establishment of the State of Israel would, quote, have a soothing effect on the Arabs and make them regain their right sense of proportion, end quote. And the Yishuv is a Western progressive factor which will be a great stimulant to any social progress in the Middle East, which will open new commercial markets, end quote. The American oil companies seem to have converged on the view that control over deposits would be indirectly reinforced by having Israel as an ally in the region. And that is indeed what transpired during the 1950s and 60s, the golden age of the Seven Sisters and Gulf oil. When the US took over the role as the #1 backer of Israel after 1967, the defense of this status quo was the paramount concern. In the global offensive, the United States, the Palestine Liberation Organization, in the making of the post-Cold War order, Paul Thomas Chamberlain describes how the US regarded Palestinian liberation as a threat to the domination of the Middle East as a whole with all its invaluable oil reserves. Conversely, he writes, Israel was fast proving its value as a key strategic asset in the Middle East and a model regional policeman in the third world, end quote. All of this, it should now be cleared, followed the script first laid down in 1840. If Plan Dalet was a settler colonial script for the destruction of Palestine from 1948 onwards, it was preceded by and had its conditions of existence in the imperialist vision of an entity imposed on the land of Palestine for the production of the interests of the core, access to raw materials and markets, prevention of subversive projects in the region, buffer zones and counterweights against more distant rivals. We are dealing here with an exceedingly deep structure, not an event or two, a ratcheting up and extrapolation across 2 centuries, a worsening and intensification of patterns first developed in the early 19th, also, not coincidentally, the temporal form of global warming itself. I have pointed very quickly and superficially here to 3 further pivotal moments of articulation. In 1917 and after, the British occupation of Palestine was part of the transformation of the Middle East into a foundation for fossil capital by dint of its oil resources. In 1947 and after, Western support for the new Zionist state was informed by the consummation of that order. In 1967 and after, by its defense. The steps along the way to the destruction of Palestine were simultaneously steps along the way to that of the earth. Shall I end there?
That would be a good place.
Yes. My idea was to take this into the present situation with oil and its role in the genocide, but let's leave it there for now.
Yeah. I think, okay.
Yeah.
Thanks,
Yeah.
Andreas. Okay, So please, questions, comments. Yes.
Sorry. Thank you very much for this wonderful kind of overview of fossil fuel in the region. But it struck me that there's an element of contingency, which you're kind of leaving out of the story about the deep structure and the kind of inevitable unfolding, which you see. If there'd been no ammunition in the acre would not have been destroyed, right? And one of what preceded this, and I think needs to be brought more into the story, was the fact that Ibrahim Pasha's whole position in Syria at that point was on the brink. Yeah, there'd been a massive revolt against him, led by a Palestinian notable, Ahmed, and he had gone as far as Karak across the Jordan in order to suppress it. So part of the reason why he's so far deployed and pushed towards the coast is the fact that the interior is in revolt against him, and so it's a very narrow sort of position. Then you talked about him as being an Arab proto-empire. He may or may not have spoken Arabic. His father certainly didn't, and I think Khalid Fahmy has shown it's very much an Ottoman kind of state enforced, and it's actually Ottoman sources which would allow you to complement the history which you're talking about. So and we can push the contingencies right forward to the actual end of the Ottoman Empire, which was a close-run thing. It was quite possible to imagine an end of World War I with the Ottomans still in occupation of Acre, Haifa, the Marj ibn Amir, and probably be taking Nablus and Jerusalem, and certainly holding the East Bank. So how do you feed the contingencies into that, and how do you bring the fact of the Ottoman Empire and the fact that the British actually thought for another 40 years about maintaining the Ottoman Empire into your story?
Yeah, that's a good question. Do I need to keep using this, or? Yeah. So, like I said, the story I gave here was extremely condensed and just focused on particular things and left out an enormous amount of events. Generally, of course, when we think about historical processes, the relation between structure and contingency is one of the key recurring concerns, how to understand the relations between them. And clearly there was a lot of contingency going on here. I'm not sure that the location of the magazine as such was the big contingency, because it's pretty clear to me that the British steamers destroyed the forces of Ibrahim Pasha everywhere, and they destroyed Akka even beyond just hitting this magazine. I think the really interesting and fascinating contingency here is that Muhammad Ali was on the verge of locating coal for his own use. This is one of the things that I left out, but failed. And one of the fascinating aspects of this is that he tried to build a kind of a copy of Britain in Egypt. He built his own cotton industry to challenge the British, and it was actually the largest in the late 1830s, the largest cotton manufacturing industry anywhere in the world outside of Europe and the US. This is one of the key reasons why the British hated him, because at this particular moment they couldn't stand this kind of challenge because they were starving for markets, and Muhammad Ali's cotton industry was so powerful that it started making incursions into the markets that the British thought they had in their hands, including India itself. The problem for Muhammad Ali in building this kind of, what we today would recognize as an emerging economy based on import substitution, was that he didn't have any modern prime movers. He didn't have any water power, which was the traditional prime mover for the cotton industry, because the Nile is a slowly meandering river without falls and rapids, and he didn't have coal. So he followed the trends of capitalist development and was acutely aware that if I'm going to be able to challenge Britain here, I need coal for steam engines in my factories, but also in my boats. He wasn't, he praised steam navigation and realized that this was a very important factor on the battlefield. So he sent expeditions into Sudan and Upper Egypt to look for coal, and this was one of the reasons why he came here, because he had heard reports that in Mount Lebanon there was coal, and there was some. So he established a coal industry in Mount Lebanon that by 1839 I think managed to produce something like 2.5% of the total output that came from Britain. But people here hated working in the coal mines. Muhammad Ali who, as every empire builder, was a ruthless tyrant, and he forced people into the mines, and they detested this. And according to my Egyptian PhD student who just defended his dissertation, Egypt Ignited, on how this played out in Egypt, this was one of the main reasons for the revolt against Muhammad Ali here in Lebanon, that people abhorred coal so much and the idea of working in the coal mines that they rose up against Muhammad Ali. And the British then made use of this for their own purposes, because their intervention here was conceived of as a kind of an alliance with an internal revolt against Muhammad Ali. The big contingency is, what would have happened had Muhammad Ali been able to push into what we would today call Turkey and discovered the coal reserves in Turkey that we now know are extremely extensive? Had Egypt then been able to challenge the British Empire and become a kind of a copy of Britain in Egypt? I mean, this is the contingency that I think is most interesting to play with, because at this particular moment in the late 1830s, Egypt, and given its standing in the Arab world, this means more or less the Arab world as a whole, and given that it actually held control over much of the Arab world, was on the edge, standing between becoming a country in the core and a country in the periphery. So it had this precocious project of turning itself into an industrial core. This project was smashed in 1840, and Egypt underwent the most extreme deindustrialization anywhere in the world in the 19th century. And by the end of that century, somewhere between 93 and 100% of the Egyptian export was one single crop, an absolutely extreme specialization. And this was the moment, I think, when the relation between the capitalist core in Europe and the Arab world as a periphery was solidified, because it wasn't solid until that moment. The contingency here has to do primarily with the location of coal and the failure of Muhammad Ali to establish sufficient coal reserves to build that proto-empire. Had he managed to do so, history might have turned out very differently. That doesn't mean that we would have had less global warming, because it would have meant that you would have had a kind of a copy of Britain here very early on, but it would have meant a very different history in the relation between the West and the Orient, or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, Mohammed.
Sorry. Just a question about domestic issues in the UK leading up to this period. If you could just talk a little bit about the relationship between what was taking place in the UK prior to 1848, with all of the trouble that they were having with the cotton industry, and how that relates to Egypt and what's taking place.
Yeah. So this is something that this guy Perry, who I sort of mocked a little bit, refuses to deal with. He says there's no evidence that there was any kind of capitalist, well, he refers to it as a conspiracy, if that's what we Marxists think, that there's some kind of conspiracy. That's not how things work, but but there's a mountain of evidence about the primary driver of expansion into the Middle East being precisely to open it for what was then referred to as commerce. So the problem the cotton industry faced in the 1830s was that it had been the spearhead of the Industrial Revolution for about half a century, but it had run so far ahead of the rest of the economy in terms of new machinery and heightened labor productivity, that it churned out these enormous piles of thread and fabric that the rest of the economy couldn't absorb. So there was a very severe crisis of overproduction in the cotton industry after 1825 in particular. And in this moment, two things happened. One was that the fairly weak Ottoman Empire, partly weakened by the expansion of Muhammad Ali and Ibrahim Pasha, agreed to a fabulously favorable free trade agreement called the Balta-Liman Treaty in 1838 that opened the Ottoman Empire to essentially limitless British exports. And this was hailed as, you know, the path to reviving the British cotton industry, because then you would have all of these outlets for the products. But Muhammad Ali did exactly the opposite to the Balta-Liman Treaty, and he refused to accept this treaty, and his lands were expanding. And you know, when the war broke out in 1840, he was again almost on the verge of taking over the Ottoman Empire, and the whole Ottoman fleet had defected to his side. So the fear that the British had was that the whole Balta-Liman project will collapse and the entire Ottoman Empire will fall into someone who is very protectionist. So this will suffocate our cotton industry even more. Yeah. And it was only when Napier took his steamer to Alexandria and said, I'm going to turn your city into the next Akka if you don't accept the Balta-Liman Treaty, that Muhammad Ali did so, and that all the lands controlled by Egypt, which then shrunk very rapidly, were opened for export, and then the British cotton industry could come in and destroy the Egyptian cotton industry, because without any protection, it won out in the competition, largely because it was powered by steam engines that Muhammad Ali didn't have access to. And then, of course, Egypt was turned into what the British say, and here, you know, it's ridiculous with these British historians who somehow find a way to suppress this evidence, because it's everywhere in the primary sources. The British, the Lord Palmerston and everyone who reported to him said that Egypt's destiny is to be an agricultural country. It shouldn't have any machines. It's not in their, you know, these Arabs can't have machines or factories or anything like that. Their fate is to cultivate raw cotton for us. And this is, of course, what Egypt became. It became one of the most important suppliers of raw cotton for Egypt, for Europe, for the UK, particularly important during the cotton famine of the American Civil War. So this is some of the background, the domestic background of the cotton industry, and I think it's really, really important to understand this historical moment as a result of inherent contradictions in capitalist industry in Britain that enforced it to compelled it to expand in this manner. Yeah.
Other Nadia?
Yeah, thanks, Andreas, for that. That was really great. I mean, I guess I want to prompt you to engage with the part you left out at the end on Gaza and what's happening today. I mean, given that, obviously that there's this kind of reading capital as structure and, structure that is fed by a certain logic, but as well as, placing Zionism in the context of, I think you called it a superstructure in relationship to the base of fossil economy or fossil capital. And I suppose from the moment now, the kind of historicization that you're doing is also a response to a certain event, I suppose. We could, the structure has a longue durée, but there are attempts at breaking with the structure. There are events that bring the structure into light or allow us to see it as a totality, albeit at a very faint moment. We grasp it, but then it always goes away. So I guess my question is to maybe if you could, bring us into the moment. So after October 7, this event, right, that happens of an attempt to break out of the structure, let's put it that way. And then also, what kind of vested interests of capital are you seeing playing out in this moment in relationship to what you laid out there?
Yeah, one of the kind of fascinating and also, of course, scary things about developments in recent years is that we have a kind of a frenzy for fossil fuels going on since a few years. It was massively accelerated after the war in Ukraine when profits skyrocketed. But the big fossil fuel companies, and if you read The Guardian, you see reports about this coming out almost every day. There was a new one today. These big fossil fuel companies are throwing capital into the exploration and extraction of fossil fuels more than ever before, just at the moment when it's more destructive than ever before, and when we need to limit this and turn it into its opposite, that is a dismantling of the fossil fuel industry to have any kind of chance to limit global warming so that we have a livable planet. And in this frenzy, for the first time, we have a direct involvement of the state of Israel and the capital based in it. And you might be aware of the gas fields that are partly in territory claimed by Lebanon, Karish and Leviathan. And not only that, but capital based in Israel is part of the expansion of fossil fuels primarily in the North Sea. So there is a company based in Tel Aviv called Ithaca Energy, which now owns two of the biggest carbon bombs, the new mega projects in the North Sea, called the Cambo and the Rosebank. And when it was introduced on the London Stock Exchange in 2022, it was the largest flotation of that year. So these are becoming quite major players. And so for the first time in the past few years, the state of Israel itself has developed a fossil fuel industry. Now, very briefly, the Tufan al-Aqsa operation threw a spanner into this expansion, and the Tamar gas field, which you can see from northern Gaza on a clear day apparently, was closed because it was perceived to be within the range of rocket fire. And there was great lamentation about this in the West. It was opened up after 5 weeks when the northern Gaza Strip had been turned into rubble comfortably, and Chevron, which is the main corporation here, resumed operations. And soon after also announced new investment, a second round of investment in this gas field to expand output even more. And just around the time when the ground invasion started, the state of Israel offered 12 licenses for exploration in what it perceives as its waters. And one of the companies that picked up some of these licenses was BP, which was the company that originally, of course, discovered oil in the Middle East and built the Kirkuk-Haifa pipeline. But now, for the first time, you have this kind of reciprocal imbrication between Israeli capital and British and other Western capital in this fossil fuel frenzy. And in a sense, this is the prophecy of the Anglo-Zionists from 1840 being fulfilled. The Palestinians, of course, have no stake in this process. They don't have any rigs, they don't have any platforms, they don't have any pipelines, they don't have any companies on the London Stock Exchange. Of course, the UAE and Egypt and Saudi Arabia do, and that's the political ecology of normalization. Normalization as a unification of Gulf capital and Israeli capital and Israel in the process of destroying both Palestine and planet. And then I think another important aspect that we really should keep in mind when it comes to the role of fossil fuels in this ongoing genocide is that you might have seen this report that there's been this tremendous emissions spike in Gaza during the genocide, where the emissions from all the fuel that is burned by the fighter jets and the tanks in the first, I think, 60 days equal the annual emissions of something like 33 low-emitting countries. So there's, plume of CO2 coming from the battlefield, which is, of course, based on the fact that military operations of this kind can only happen through a tremendous consumption of fossil fuels, being the power that give all these that put these projectiles in their trajectory. And this is the same logic as in 1840, when again, but on a much vaster scale, the power of fossil fuels is deployed to pulverize the living quarters of Palestine. And one thing that we tend to forget here is precisely it's just how important the militaries are for maintaining business as usual. And I think it's something like 5.5% of annual CO2 emissions come from military apparatuses. But these are peacetime emissions, so that's before they go to war. So only maintaining their logistics, their bases, this is of course primarily the US, requires just this insane combustion of fossil fuels. And then when they actually go into war, this intensifies. There's a very good book about this by, I think, Netta Crawford is her name, if you're interested in this. But I think, military violence was central, and she shows this quite effectively in her book, central to the development of fossil fuel economies all through, from the early 19th century up to the present. And it's a very hard nut to crack. I mean, we can envision various kinds of energy transition, but how are we going to beat the military wing of the US empire, which totally relies on fossil fuels for its projection of destructive power around the world?
Yes.
Can I keep it like that? Thank you, Andreas. That was fascinating. I will, if you mind, return back to the 1840 and even perhaps even earlier than that, looking at your story from the Greek shores, where I think, interestingly, that would be my first question, where you see Zionism, how you describe it, whether it was not necessarily the first template of reviving a past, a biblical past, for contemporary imperialist uses, but how Hellenism became, in fact, the first template. You know, modern Greece as the child of that kind of intervention. By the way, modern Greece was also the place where the British ships countered Egyptian navy in the Battle of Navarino, which were also correct. It was the last battle fought with sailing boats. You're right, and the first battle fought with steam boats was off the coast of Lebanon. So my question is mainly whether you can see in your research, you know, this continuity from Hellenism all the way to Zionism, of course, by the same people. You know, there was also the same imperial British thinkers. In both cases, the subjects were absent. Greeks were absent, Jews were absent, but, you know, eventually they filled up the gaps. And that's whether if you have, you know, discovered this continuity in any sense or form, and how does that change?
Noticed it.
Nothing. There's nothing like that.
It's not something that I've seen at all. So you tell the story.
No, I'm really seriously asking you if whether you saw this continuity. And I think it must be interesting to look back and see how Hellenism served as a template for Zionism after that.
Never heard of this.
Anyway, the second thing was mostly about how steam engine might have influenced, framed this new imagination of Zionism that you're trying to say here. You know, did the materiality of steam add anything to the ideational, you know, imagining of Zionism, or how this, apart from the steam power that destroyed everything, of course, that was clear, was it any other element that gave it prowess, imaginative prowess?
Good question. Well, first of all, let me just point out. So I haven't noticed this stuff about Hellenism at all. But it sounds like a very fascinating path. But one thing that I've certainly noticed is that the French employed steam power at around the same time, and in some cases a little bit earlier, in their attacks on Algeria. And there's so, you know, the colonization of Algeria was a similar project undertaken very largely by the power of steam. There is a book that's just come out by Mohammed Amr Mezin, I think his name is, called States of the Earth, about how a particular, you know, the French secularist hostility to Islam and steam power fused at a particular moment of the colonization of Algeria. And this, I think, is a fairly similar story to the one I'm gesturing at here. On the relation between steam technology and actual early Zionist colonization, well, that colonization didn't get underway until the 1880s and 90s. And it's not something that I have looked into. So what I told you here is just based on research. And you know, I was in the archives 11 years ago. I haven't had a chance to return to the archives. So, you know, what comes straight from the archives of what I said here is 11 years old. And at that point, I focused exclusively on this particular period, not on the 1880s and 90s, but I just quoted one piece. I think that if you were to look into the development of the first colonies in Palestine, you would probably see a lot of this rhetorical and technological linking up with steam power in various ways. But then during the mandate itself, oil became king. That was the new big thing.
No, I'm saying the new techno.
Yeah, that kind of thing. Yes.
Any other questions or comments?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So my question is, other than Marxism, which was ultimately, let's say, they hoped to realize it with the Commune in Paris, right? Around 1840s, also, or 1870s, right? Was the 1840 Zionist project the first ideological frenzy? I'm asking a Western historian here. Is it the first ideological frenzy in the post-Enlightenment age? Do you think it's one of the first ideological frenzies that was widespread and shared in the post-Enlightenment phase?
You mean if there were no other ideological frenzies of this kind? You mean?
I mean, widely shared, or
No. I think I think let's say the period from 1780s up to the 1840s was a period rife with various kinds of ideological frenzies. I don't think that this was unique in the sense that this was the only kind of mania of this kind. There were quite a lot of them, I think, including manias for steam as such. I mean, all of this stuff about steam might come across as a little bit, musty and hoary and nerdy, but when you go into you immerse yourself in this kind of life world of early 19th century Britain, mid 19th century, steam is absolutely everywhere because it was the new technology that changed so many things, and of course people had a kind of an ideological frenzy about it. And this also included various schemes for filling the world with steamboats in various ways. So in Britain at this moment in time, in 1820s and 1830s, there were, for instance, these schemes for filling the rivers of India with steamboats. India was the crown colony, and Britain had all of these schemes for how this would bring civilization to India, and it would bring prosperity back to Britain, all this stuff. This didn't really happen, or it happened many decades later. And this is a little bit similar to the mania I described here, where you first have the idea and then you have the material practice, where there's kind of an excess of intentions almost, that the British have all of these incredibly fantastic schemes for how they're going to rule the world in this way or that. And fortunately for bourgeois visionaries, their visions tend to come true at a certain point, unlike ours. But not all of them did, but this was a very, very visionary period in that sense, if you see what I mean. So I think we shouldn't maybe see this as a unique thing, but rather that it was tied together with a lot of ideological frenzy that came with, this was a moment in time when Britain really ruled the world, and it had this new amazing technology by which to rule the world even more. And all these ideas about how great we British are and how civilized and all this.
So excuse for the crude follow-up.
Yes.
So in this sense, at least, we could say that the steam and the innovations and everything worked as it's steroids.
Yes.
Ideology's ultimate hope is to establish, let's say, perfection, however we define it, however the ideologues define it.
Yes.
So this only worked as steroids, even if you can consider it maybe even a side ideology,
yes.
even
Yes.
Technological is itself,
Yes.
So this is.
Yes, and it also has an incredibly important part in the history of racism. This is one of the arguments that we make in White Skin, Black Fuel, that in the 19th century, this is largely drawn from a great book called Machines as the Measure of Men. Up until the 19th, I don't remember the name of the author, up until the 19th century, a lot of racism had been more or less based on religion in one way or another, but the kind of secularized racism that became popular in the 19th century was very largely based on the notion that we white people are better than all the non-whites because we have the machines that are the best, that are superior, by which we can dominate others. And this is the insignia of our superiority. This is everywhere in British discourse around this time. And it transformed ideologies of racism in the West and put them on a pseudo-scientific basis, of course. Yeah, it kind of put racism on steroids as well.
Oh yes, please.
Thank you so much for this talk. This just occurred to me as a kind of follow-up to this last question and answer about this frenzy around STEAM, right, that you see it everywhere in the archive. And it made me think about how AI, right, like how there's this frenzy now. When you talk about pedagogy in the classroom, like so many workshops that happen here at this university, probably many. And so, we're thinking about STEAM as you've eloquently showed us in this talk, fueling warfare, and how we see AI in precision technologies, in facial recognition technologies, and of course it connects to your answer about racism too. And maybe this is sort of the part that was left out, or the part that we'll see posted on Verso, but I was wondering if you could sort of...
Well, the first thing I was seeing as this kind of automated, mechanized killing machinery.
Yeah.
It's so fucking scary. Sorry?
Smart killing.
Yeah, smart killing. But it's actually opposite. In a way, it kind of negates itself because it's supposed to be smarter. But what it does, it reverts to older kinds of atomic war, nuclear. Just destroy everything. But it's presumably based on the idea that here, after Tufan al-Aqsa, they had to kill so many people that they didn't have the manpower to process all the data themselves. So they kind of delegated this task to the machines, to the AI, processing all this data, and then they just go in and bomb everything. And one of the sort of final reflections that I had here, and that's going to be in there, is that I think technology has a fascinating and incredibly scary role in this genocide. Where, of course, one of the things that really shocked both the State of Israel and its allies on October 7 was how Israel, with all its incredible superiority on the battlefield, just crumbled completely. And I don't think, it's very difficult to find a proper analogy to that in the annals of anti-colonial insurgency, where you have that kind of military asymmetry between a guerrilla force and its enemy completely negated in the span of a few hours. And the response to this from Israel and its allies, from the US, was that, okay, the only way to kind of rehabilitate this technology and this dominance, this superiority, restore the deterrence, is to just go berserk and roll out the full capacity of destruction. And what this most recent piece suggested, that it's almost like the genocide is kind of outsourced to the machines themselves, a combination of artificial intelligence and fossil fuels that are just destroying Gaza. And this kind of technological revenge, it's almost like a revenge of the technology itself, where you have these films where the soldiers are gloating over the prowess of destruction when they blew up the schools and homes, and of course trying to send this message to enemies elsewhere, not least in this country, that if you try to do anything like the resistance did on October 7, we're going to obliterate you and your people like we're doing in Gaza. This is a rehabilitation of the technological mastery, and I don't think we can see this kind of dynamic in any other genocide that I can think of. There was no similar dynamic in the Bosnian Muslim genocide. The genocide in Rwanda was largely made by machetes. The Daesh genocide against the Yazidis was a low-tech genocide. The Shoah was, of course, the emblematic high-tech genocide, but it wasn't preceded by that kind of a sudden subversion of technological mastery. So perhaps we can say that this is the first techno-genocide, in the sense that it's both executed by the most advanced technology and partly animated by a desire to restore the supremacy of technological mastery. And this is, of course, against the background of everything that has happened since 1840, which was the first moment when the West established this kind of extreme military superiority here. And I don't think anything during all these years has negated that supremacy, like what happened on October 7th.
Yeah, so this is hard for me to maybe express, but so one thing about this kind of explosion of violence and this how the agency of, or let's say the agent of the violence is somehow being outsourced to AI or these immensely powerful and complicated connections of fossil fuels and the production of fossil fuel and distribution of fossil fuel and weapons and all of this. It seems it's really hard from, let's say, the individual's point of view to look at the world right now and not see it like the flood, like God is just erasing everything, and like there's almost like it's really hard to distinguish the agency of the individuals behind the violence and massive forces that seem to be operating on their own beyond that. So AI and fossil fuels, we're talking about that, but that it just becomes and I don't know where to draw the line, between, let's say, if we were to put this in terms of like reasons and causes, or draw the line between, a natural evil or a moral evil. It seems like we're at a point historically where the distinction is pointless or uninformative even from a moral point of view, or maybe I'm just very
No,
confused.
I completely understand what you're getting at. I mean, it's, of course, it's difficult not to be overwhelmed by this feeling of just constant destruction and devastation and wonder, okay, what's going on here? Is it humanity? Is it some other factor? I mean, you're easily drawn to that kind of metaphysical speculation, although I would personally perhaps think that it's more the work of an evil force rather than a good force. It's not. I wouldn't believe that it's God who's sending this flood, I think to me, the evidence for the power of some kind of an evil force in the world is much more immediately present than the evidence of a good force. Yeah. But if we stay away from the metaphysics, although I think we perhaps shouldn't stay away from the metaphysics, but scientifically, I think clearly when it comes to what's going on in climate, it's evident that things are out of control, that these processes are running amok, and everything that governments and others have done so far has failed to rein this in to even the most minimal degree, because fossil fuel expansion is just having a life of its own, but it's like a demonic force. And I think, this is perhaps a more scientific, accurate explanation of it, and something that Wim and I toy with a little bit in this book coming out in the next few months. When Freud speaks about the demonic forces that take over in a person's life, that doesn't mean that the demonic force is actually some kind of a metaphysical entity, but it's, in a sense, it's an emergent property that starts to control that person, so that the behavior of the person is out of the person's control. This is what we mean when we refer to someone being possessed by some kind of inner demon, right? And by analogy, capitalist society has produced these demons that are completely out of control and that are ruling this society. And what's going on in the Middle East now is, in a way, pretty similar, because the forces of destruction are, again, completely out of control.
Just to this is what, so if you listen to the genocide proceedings in ICJ,
yes.
And of course they're very interested in intent. They want to know about the intention behind the people committing the genocide, and that's how you establish it in a court of law. But if you look at Palestine as a genocide, as a precursor for the genocides to come, right? Because of the way AI is developing, the way countries need to expand and find new places to, extract fossil fuels. And these large processes, like you're saying, they're emergent processes that determine individual policies and things like that. I don't know. Here, we're kind of off from what you're talking about, but it seems like we need to think about genocide and the perpetration of genocide without this idea of the intention. behind the genocide? Because it seems like whether or not someone in Israel decided to do this, there's an element of the inevitable, kind of the way you're describing from 1840 to now, that genocide shouldn't be tried, or yeah, you get
Oh,
my
that's a
point,
good
yeah.
point.
Okay, if there are no final comments, Tarek? Yeah.
So Tim Mitchell distinguishes between coal and oil among fossil fuels. Do you think there's a difference in this kind of long structure, or does it?
Yes, I don't have anything to object to his analysis as far as I can remember. I mean, it's quite a long time since I read his book, but I mean, his key argument that coal-empowered workers in Europe, and this was an inducement for European powers to shift towards oil, which was less labor-intensive, and you could less democratic. You can draw, yeah, exactly. You can source the oil from here, from the Middle East, from these autocratic governments, but then in the end it produces some kind of a, you know, various kinds of vulnerabilities and conflicts. I buy that historical schema. I mean, I don't have any. Or is that what you have in mind, or?
I don't know whether there's a particular difference for Palestine.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, the immediate obvious difference is that coal was never a source taken from this region to the British Empire. And the British Empire was entirely self-sufficient in coal, and it was by the means of the coal from the British mines that Britain came here and started taking over the region. Oil is, you know, the Middle East has most of the world's oil, and that was a primary reason for the British mandate and for everything that's happened ever since. Crawford shows this very elegantly in her book. So the location of coal was completely extraneous to this region. The location of oil is absolutely integral to, so it's much more a question of defending the supplies as such on the matter of oil than coal, if that makes sense. But on, you know, how this played out in during the mandate period, yeah, I haven't looked into this deeply. So,
I'm thinking more of the configuration of the imperial polity.
Yeah.
Polities themselves. Because what Mitchell argues is that because of coal, we have a stronger labor movement, because it can use this nexus of how you transform.
Yeah.
And therefore it will impact upon, whereas with oil you don't have it. And if you notice in Britain, the move towards Thatcherism coincided with the crushing of the migrant.
Yeah, but I think maybe he's overdoing his point a little bit, or it's not exactly what it says in the book, because the historical record is quite clear that you've had quite a lot of labor insurgency in the oil sector that has caused a lot of problems in the West. I'm thinking in particular of the Iranian Revolution, which was very largely as a revolutionary force based on workers' protests, partly in the oil sector, and this was, you know, one thing that led to the revolution and that caused the worst oil crisis of them all, which prompted, of course, so much more U.S. military presence in the region. There are other cases as well, but the Iranian Revolution really is the watershed moment. So it's not the case that you can't have labor unrest based on oil and that it hasn't posed a problem to the West. Clearly it has. So either he's overdoing his point or he's saying this in the latter parts of his book. I don't remember.
Okay, I think this would be a good point to close. Thanks, if you all join me in thanking Andreas for a great